Staying on topic, now let's talk about your latest announcement, which was a new measure to calculate the natural resource wealth share. I'm trying to remember so I don't make a mistake, but it's called G factor for natural resources, and it's a new way to calculate what is the share of natural resource wealth that a mining company is delivering to the host country's government. And the way it's calculated is you have the mineral royalty tax, you have your corporate tax, you have dividend in the case of Kajim in Zambia because the government is your partner in that venture, and divided by the total revenue that the company generates. Now, Gemfields is a listed company, so this type of information is already in the public domain, and you publish a lot of data on a regular basis. So why create this? Why make this announcement? Why create this measure and put a sort of label on it? Isn't it just the same information that's already out there?
Well, I think that the challenge that I would give anybody that thinks it's the same information that's already out there is to pick up the annual reports of a number of internationally listed mining companies and see how long it takes you to try and discern the information that you're getting in a very simple single measure in terms of the G factor. If you need to go and dig out the amount of money paid in a particular calendar year in corporation taxes by subsidiary, and then the mineral royalty paid by subsidiary in different parts of an annual report, then pick up the revenue, which may have been through a number of accounting adjustments. In my experience, it's extremely difficult to do. It's rather opaque, not by design or intent. It's just the way that the data sometimes is delivered. And so our idea was in keeping with the old adage that you cannot manage what you do not measure, was to try and come up with a very simple mechanism that essentially tries to create a measure that looks at the efficiency of converting a natural resource into contributions to the host government. In other words, what share of that natural resource's value is going or accruing to the host government. So as you've described, it's a very simple measure. We're basically taking the key taxes paid to the government in the form of mineral royalty plus corporation tax, plus if the government's a shareholder, the dividend, and we divide that by the total revenue that's been derived from that mineral resource, and that's expressed as a percentage. So very quickly, for example, with the Montepuez Ruby mine, we find that some 30% of revenue, not 30% of profit, which is what a normal tax rate looks like, but 30% of revenue has been paid in the last 5 years to the Mozambican government. And so I think that's a remarkable figure. And I don't believe that at any time before in the history of humanity or our planet has any colored gemstone deposit contributed that big a percentage, or indeed that big an absolute number in terms of dollars to a host nation. And so the great thing with a simple measure like that is you can immediately start comparing different types of operations. A government can say, what percentage do we get from our coal resources? What percentage do we get from our fishing resources? What percentage do we get from our timber resources? And of course, within any one given sector, you can then also say, if I'm looking only at the gemstone sector, let's see how the different companies stack up. And if one company is paying 25% of revenue in taxes and another's paying 10% of its revenue in taxes, it makes it much easier for people to pick up problems and to go and find out what's going on. And, I grew up in Africa, wonderful continent, I think perhaps the most promising on the planet, filled with inspiring people. And it is very sad that over the last 100, 150 or 200 years, that the birthright of many African citizens in terms of their natural resources have disappeared, either at the hands of overseas businesses that are making the profits overseas, and or sometimes at the hands of corrupt politicians, sometimes working with corrupt businessmen. And unless we cast a light on the numbers and we have a measure by which we can compare and contrast the performance, then that cycle is simply going to repeat itself. And I think it helps build a lot of confidence where people can see the facts and the figures for themselves and make a direct comparison. One of the problems with taxation, of course, is that it's devilishly complicated. And on many occasions, our finance team have walked me through, for example, Kajim's tax computation in a given year. And at the bottom, you can see the corporation tax sum that needs to be paid. But if you ask me half an hour after I've had a 3-hour explanation as to how the tax computation works to explain the same tax computation to somebody else, there's no chance. Forget it. Tax is very complicated. All the deductions and this and that, and it's a nightmare. And so this measure, we believe, allows companies, citizens, government officials, NGOs, and a host of other parties in a flash to get a very simple measure of what's cooking with a particular natural resource company, whether they're in mining, timber, fishing, oil, gas, any natural resources. So we think it's a great step forward.
But again, the taxes would differ from country to country and region to region. So I guess one would have to take that into account, because some countries may have a very low, but then that's why you have the corporate tax and all the rest of it. Okay, so I have another question related to this. Now, when we look at the diamond industry, let's say approximately 80% of mining of diamonds is institutionalized, whereas let's say maybe 20% approximately is coming from artisanal sources. But with respect to the colored gemstone industry, it's probably the other way around, where 70 to 80% of colored gemstones are sourced through artisanal sources, and only 20%. I mean, if I look at Gemfields or look at potentate mining in North America or MTC in Colombia, and they're just, so in that sense, despite your scale and size, institutional mining companies are kind of in minority in that sense in the colored gemstone sector. So, and awarding mineral rights and mining concessions and the natural resources of a country, it's quite a contentious subject, can be a contentious subject. So what are some of the challenges that Gemfields has faced or continues to face as an institutional investor and operator?
Good question. Sometimes a very controversial topic, and very understandably also one that evokes many different emotions in different stakeholder groups, and I think importantly so. There are a lot of myths, there are a lot of misunderstandings, and I think sometimes we encounter circumstances where people potentially wearing slightly academic or ivory tower hats, who may not necessarily have been on the ground, design systems or policies or procedures by which things should be done. And I think the critical thing is always to have dialogue between the stakeholders and get the right people who have the experience and have been on the ground to sit down, discuss it, learn from one another. Nobody knows all of the answers. But I think the biggest problem for me is that very often people perceive this as being some sort of big debate between formalized large-scale miners and artisanal mining. And people perceive that as being two sides and or sitting on opposite ends of the table. And I think that really misses the point. And I say that because we have to remember that the mineral resources in the ground are the birthright of the host country's citizens. They are not there for anybody with a pick or shovel to come along and help themselves too. It's not a supermarket that's open for looting. The natural resource has to serve the country as a whole and the country's citizens as a whole. And therefore, we should be agnostic for a moment as to the mining method, whether it's large scale, artisanal, a hybrid, or some other mechanism. And what we should focus on is, surely the goal is to make the most of that natural resource, to get the maximum value for that natural resource back into the host country, not with the money being made overseas, and then to ensure that the money and the natural resource is used to deliver the maximum long-term benefit to the country and the local communities in terms of education, sustainability from a livelihoods perspective once the mining operation stops because the resources are finite. And if that is our goal, and certainly we believe that to be our goal, we are very happy to listen and learn to anybody who believes that there is a better way to achieve those objectives. In other words, get the maximum international value for the resource, get 100% of that money back into the host country, and then have the resource and the money deliver maximum long-term benefit for the country and the host communities. That should be the focus. And there are many cases around the world where artisanal mining works very well and should be deployed and provides important livelihoods. And a great case in point, for example, is gold. And I say that in some cases, obviously, it's very tricky because sometimes arsenic gets used, cyanide rather, and cyanide obviously has very, very serious environmental implications. But there are other cases where artisanal gold mining works very well. And the reason it can work is because it's very simple, or relatively simple, for an artisanal miner to understand the value of their production and therefore to make sure that they're getting appropriately paid. A big issue that we encounter in artisanal gemstone mining is that the artisanal miners, and sometimes illegal miners, are totally exploited by unscrupulous dealers and traders, or indeed they're formally engaged by syndicates, sometimes who are in conflict with one another, who pay the artisanal miner or the illegal miner a fraction of the real international market price. And the gem then leaves the country, the profit gets made overseas, and we're then dealing with a situation where the value of that local natural resource is being obliterated without the money flowing back into the host country. And we think that's the primary objective. And that's one of the reasons why we're so transparent with all of our facts and figures, is because we think it's important for everybody to understand the value that does get created that way, the taxation that gets paid, and the community projects that get undertaken. So, I think the critical thing is, remember that the natural resources are the birthright of the host country citizens, and any miner, whether it's large scale, small scale, artisanal, or otherwise, should never really regard the gemstones as being theirs. They don't belong to Gemfields. Our task rather is to be the custodians of those gemstones on behalf of the host country citizens. Go and get the maximum international price, bring 100% of the money back to Mozambique and or Zambia, pay the taxes as should be done, create the jobs and the employment, and then obviously run the projects that develop education, healthcare, and livelihoods. It's people often like to try and see things in very simple binary yes or no manners, but the reality is the pictures on the ground sometimes are very complex, and there are so many different parameters that have to be taken into account. But there are often also discussions about whether or not it's better for people to buy synthetic gemstones or laboratory-made diamonds.
Yes.
And from my perspective, and indeed our perspective, the answer is a resounding no. The host countries have the right to develop their natural resources and to use those to bolster the country, to bolster their tax take, to create employment for their citizens. And the Montepuez Ruby Mine, case in point, there were no jobs there. There were no formal jobs there. Today, there are 1,500 permanent, regular, proper paying, safe jobs. And that makes a huge difference. And so we always say it's a very important cause to keep gemstone mining going in these host countries, notwithstanding what are sometimes the complexities and difficulties.
Well, one of the things I say when someone says, I should buy a synthetic gemstone instead of a natural, that's a more sort of a better thing to do, a more responsible thing to do. I say, well, then stop using your cell phone or stop using any gadget that exists in your life and, just go live in the forest, because everything that we use, this, my laptop through which we're doing the Zoom, it has components that came out of the ground that were mined. So, okay. Speaking of, now I feel like you've already answered my next question, but I'll ask it anyway. The Argyle Diamond Mine in Australia recently closed doors after 40 years of operations. And you mentioned that, yes, a gem deposit or a diamond deposit is finite. And so eventually it will either run out or it will financially not be feasible to mine that deposit anymore. So how can a finite resource be sustainable? Can it be sustainable? And what can or should mining companies do beyond tax revenue to uplift the lives of the communities surrounding the mines?
Yeah, excellent question, Richa. And I do sometimes smile and sometimes despair when we hear the leaders of some natural resources companies, not only in the mining sector,
right,
but talking at length about sustainability and what that means. But at its base level, sustainable means just that. You can keep doing it. And by definition, natural resources are finite. No mine is sustainable in that context. QED, end of story. You can try and cover it in cotton wool and corporate speak and marketing for all you like, but the reality is the natural resource is finite, and the mine will at some point stop. And so the only way that you can legitimately sort of attach, as many corporations these days wish to do, the sustainability phrase to a mining operation. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about maximizing the long-term benefit of those natural resources in the country, is to make sure that you have the right community projects up and running. For us, those focus on education, which is incredibly important, and the schools that we've helped to rebuild or build from scratch in Mozambique. There are now 2,500 children who attend those. We started a vocational training center that teaches to adults key skills in masonry, electrical work, plumbing, and the like. We run healthcare programs. And obviously, you also have to run livelihoods programs that assist people in working out more sustainable ways, which would allow them to continue with livelihoods and or businesses for decades and hopefully generations beyond the point at which the mine itself ceases. And so it's all about equipping children with the education and adults with the skills as best one can to make sure that there are livelihoods and employment well beyond the end of the mining operation's life. Now, in Mozambique, we have at least 15 years and probably some years beyond that of reserve life left for rubies. And in Zambia, it's probably 20 to 25 years. in the event that the prices for emeralds and rubies increase over time, as we certainly believe they will, that means that one can mine more of the resource, because obviously it becomes economically viable to do that. And so maybe those two operations will run for some period of time beyond that. But nonetheless, the more one can do in terms of establishing education, creating futures, creating livelihoods, and therefore ensuring that employment in other forms will be available is critically important. Also to the so-called social license that any mining company has in a host country. And people have to see that you are there to not only mine the resource in a responsible manner and make sure the country gets its fair share, but to make sure you're working with the local communities to ensure that the future is better for them.
So yeah, well, thank you so much for your time today, and despite being on the road, and well, wish you all the best for the current emerald auction that's going on, and hopefully production can keep up in Zambia and in Mozambique, and 2021 ends on a high note. Thank you very much.
Indeed. We certainly share those wishes also. Richa, thank you very much for your time and enthusiasm, and very best to you and also to your viewers.